Thank you very much for coming this evening. And it's with great pleasure that I am here to introduce Amir Parsa, who's a PhD student who's studying with Dr. Roy Fischel at SOAS and is about to finish, he tells me, in January to submit, so congratulations on that. And he's here to talk to us tonight on patriarchal honour, women and war, the concept of Namus in Naderid military narrative. So we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Of course, this is not.
Are we? You need to mute a few people, yes. So having had that interruption, I would just say something briefly on housekeeping, all right? We're getting more and more familiar with things as time goes on, but I think Amir will be happy to take questions, of course, from the audience at the end, and also from people on the Zoom, but if they can relay their questions through the chat, and then we'll be we can deal with them as they come through. So I can't take up any more time. It's your time to present.
Thank you very much. Okay. Good evening, thank you for coming. I would like to begin to talk by basically giving a rough overview of what it's about and how it's going to unfold. The basic concept is going to be that of Namus, or how to basically translate this. It would be difficult, but think of it as a patriarchal notion of sexual honour and gendered honour. And we're going to talk about how the elite in Iran, especially the military elite and the ruling elite, think about this concept as they justify their military rise and they justify their conquests. So the term Namus comes from the ancient Greek nomos, which literally means law or custom. When it entered into Arabic and subsequently Persian usage, it came to mean something very specific to do with family-related sexual honor. It's basically central to the image of the ideal woman in early modern Iran. An ideal woman and an ideal family is one which is namusdar, or one which has this quality, this value of namus. And it's reflected in a variety of sources. We don't have a great many sources from women from the Safavid period, but we do have one or two. And I'm going to basically quote the beginning of one of the letters that we have from Maryam Begum, a Safavid princess, who's writing to her own mother. So it's a correspondence between two women. And she begins by addressing her mother with a litany of titles and honorifics. And these are it. She of the highest status, that refuge of chastity, that axis of virtue and purity, epitome of benevolence, and incorruptibility, and most covered, satire. This is quite typical of the correspondence that women have with one another and also with male relatives. The beginning and the end always make sure to basically couch the female's identity and her social role in namus-related ideas, ideas of chastity, of domesticity, of purity. So what we have is a culture which has a very specific idea on how women fit into elite society, how women ought to act, and what kind of values women are supposed to embody. And this doesn't just come out in the official correspondence, it's a fact of day-to-day life. When Safavid women were taken out, and I mean elite Safavid women, or aristocratic women, especially women of the royal harem, they did go out, but under very specific circumstances. There is a Mongolian term, uruk. Uruk means basically to guard, to keep. And what it referred to was a procession. Before the royal harem could move its women from the royal palace to, say, the hunting ground, what it would do was send out guards, eunuchs, castrated slaves, to basically clear the path, make sure no male stranger is in that path, and any male stranger that can't move, say it's his land, it's his farmstead, he was supposed to look away or even be blindfolded until the procession of royal women had passed. So there's a clear idea that women, especially if they come from elite and royal households, they have a very restricted access to the public. Or rather, the perception that is trying to be put out there is that the access of the public to such women is very restricted. There are some accounts by European travellers in the late 17th century, which I'm going to talk about, which give us a very good idea, I think, of specific aspects to do with chastity and what happens when these norms and these sexual mores are transgressed against. Sanson, a European traveller who travelled to Safavid Iran, I think in the 1670s, writes in his memoirs of the punishments meted out to women who basically transgressed these sexual mores. He says that married women who commit adultery are punished, and they're punished by execution. They're taken up to a tower where they're hurled from the top of the tower down to the very bottom. If women were unmarried, what would happen is that the town bailiff would take them, put them on a donkey, reverse them so they were facing the tail, parade them through the town while shaving their head and rubbing dirt in their face and on their head. This was supposed to also signal the fact that these concepts had social and legal consequences. The idea is that if one transgresses these bounds, it doesn't just bring shame on the individual, it's a familial shame which is felt, and it's going to be excised and dealt with communally by a family, by the community at large. There's also a very interesting account. It's very interesting because it's an eyewitness account that Sanson gives an honour killing, and not the honour killing itself, but rather the consequences of that honour killing at court. He attends the bailiff's kind of council to judge whether or not the mother and son are guilty. And at that council, he hears that the mother and son, upon finding out that the daughter had been engaging in sexual relations with someone who was not her husband, they're charged with murder, and the mother orders the son to kill the daughter, his sister, sorry. After doing so, they basically bury the body, and it's only a few days after that that the neighbours alert the town bailiff, and this council is held. And at this council, Sanson basically relates the following account of when the town bailiff asks the son, "Why is it that you thought you had the right to kill your sister?" He responds in the following way. This is Sanson's account now. He said he had done a good deed, and that what she had done, the sister, was deserving of death, so that by killing such an unchaste sister, he had in fact restored the honour of his family and of his creed. After the mother confirmed that the killing was done on her orders, the judge absolved the mother and son from any wrongdoing, and even gifted the boy with a robe of honor, khalat, and treated them as distinguished guests at his court. So, and Sanson is very much shocked by this and taken aback by this. How could someone who committed the murder and openly confessed and bragged about the murder be not only absolved of any wrongdoing, but be rewarded in this way? He basically comes to the conclusion that it's because of Islam. He says that the Persians, despite being the most cultured, the most intelligent people of the East, yet they are held back and made irrational by the doctrines of Islam, which is quite curious because according to the Sharia, he would still be guilty of murder. The reason why he's let go and even rewarded are very much to do with the local customs and traditions that are prevalent in early modern Iran. So this brings us to the concept of masculinity and how it's defined. Masculinity and femininity, they're not just considered to be different, but in a lot of ways, they're considered to be polar opposites. So in this way, the content of what it means to be masculine is defined negatively. There isn't a definition of masculinity per se. It basically is defined against the grain of effeminacy. It's the idea that it's defined in a spirit of hostility to women, this kind of masculinity. There's a story by Camphair, who also travels to Isfahan, the capital of the Safavid Empire, and he relates a popular joke or kind of a popular saying. And it's to do with military masculinity and effeminacy. There seems to have been this popular tale that one of the kings of Safavid Iran, Ṣafavids, campaigns against the armies of Mughal Hindustan, who are considered to be so weak against the Safavid army that one day Ṣafavids basically gives command of his army to the women of his harem. And on that day, despite this, the Safavid army still prevails. The takeaway from that for the contemporaries in Safavid Iran was a Turkish saying, to kill 40 crows, you only need 1 stone in Turkish. What that basically gets at is to destroy the Hindustani armies, all you need is 1 stone, or just 1 woman from the harem is sufficient. There's this idea of military emasculation, how to utterly emasculate the Hindustani soldiers. The best way to do it is this contrived narrative in which a woman from the harem can even militarily defeat them. This brings us to the broader subject, which is how military masculinity relates to this idea of women hatred and this idea of sexual honor, nāmus. So what I'm going to do now is basically give you an overview of what's happened in 18th century Iran and how the Safavids basically collapsed and militarism took hold in Iranian culture and especially among the ruling class. What you see is basically a map of the Safavid Empire, and towards the end, the early 18th century, there's a whole host of crises, economic, social, political, but the way this manifests, one of the major ways in which it manifests is that you have various clans who were previously subject to the authority of the emperor in Isfahan basically take up independence and even start raiding towards the interior. You have that in Dagestan, near the Russian border, with Dagestani tribes and Lazgis raiding into what is now Azerbaijan. You have that in the Kurdish areas, where various Kurdish clans no longer send tribute and in fact openly challenge the Safavid armies. and start raiding into the interior as well. The same happens in Khorāsān in the southwest, with various Arab clans raiding the environs of Shush and Bandar Abbas. Across the Gulf, various clans that were previously tributaries to the Safavid king now start raiding the coast and basically taking away tribute, taking away legitimacy from the king. And so with the Baluch, and so with the Turkmens to the northeast. But the most troubling of all is the Afghan clans in and around Kandahar. Over there, we have an uprising which begins as basically just an uprising against the local government. But because of the success that it enjoys, it balloons into a confederacy which challenges Safavid legitimacy in the east. Eventually, they not only make inroads towards Kerman, which you see in the center, they go up towards Yazd, and eventually Isfahan itself. Outside of Isfahan, they face off against a very weak, although numerous Safavid army, which they defeat. And after a 6-month-long siege of the capital, they are awarded with the diadem of kingship. The Safavid king comes out and voluntarily places the diadem of kingship on the head of the Afghan leader, who now becomes the new sovereign of Iran. Of course, whilst the siege is happening, all of the previous provinces that had not rebelled now take up independence. The north is occupied by Russian forces, the west is occupied by the Ottoman Empire, and all across Iran, various chieftains and strongmen come to power. One of these is a man by the name of Nāder. So roughly, this is the area which we're talking about, just above Mashhad in Khorāsān. This is where Nāder comes to the fore. He's a very small-time warlord. He has maybe 1,000 or 2,000 Kurdish and Turkish warriors under his command. Not a man of great significance. How he comes to significance is Prince Tahmasp, one of the Safavid princes who basically escaped the siege of Isfahan, went to the north, was defeated and chased away by the Ottomans, went further north, was defeated and chased away by the Russians, and eventually chased away by the Afghans from the south. As a matter of no choice, ends up in Khorāsān, is welcomed by Nāder. Nāder uses the legitimacy of Tahmasp to draw recruits and basically institutes a far-reaching program of military reform. Here we see, this is from the Tarikh Naderi. After Nāder rises, he basically commissions his secretary to write a history of him, and later it's... So on the left, we have Nāder, who's dismounted, and on the horse is Prince Tahmasp, who is welcomed to Khorāsān. You can see on the right, the Safavids are the ones wearing the elaborate turban, and the Khorāsāni followers of Nāder on the left are wearing the long conical hat. So, rather spectacularly, Nāder not only basically tricks his way into Tahmasp's confidence and starts to basically centralize power into his own hands, he puts it to good use. In numerous battles, he defeats the Afghans, eventually taking Isfahan. After that, he goes west, he defeats the Ottomans, he intimidates the Russians to withdraw from the north. All of these independent kind of chieftains and principalities which had propped up give homage and give troops and taxes to Nāder. And eventually what happens is that Tahmasp makes a fatal mistake. Rather quite jealous, it seems, of Nāder's campaigns and military successes, he raises his own army and in his own name campaigns against the Ottomans. It does not end well. He's defeated almost immediately, and Nāder uses that to basically have him overthrown. Eventually, this goes on to him taking on the dynasty itself. He, first of all, overthrows Tahmasp and makes himself regent. But after that, after a few years and a few more victories against the Ottomans and having the Russians completely withdraw, he establishes himself as the new emperor of Iran and a new dynasty under his own patronage. So what he does after he becomes king is not that different from what he does prior to it. It's continued military expansion abroad, and he goes to Kandahar and then Kabul, subduing the last of the remaining Afghan independent clans and kingdoms. After that, he goes on to challenge the Mughal Empire of Hindustan, and within a year, he's in Jahanabad and he's made a vassal of most of North India. After that, he goes north and crosses the Oxus River and takes on the Khanates of Bukhara and of Khiva in Central Asia, which was at that time called Turan or Turkestan. Pretty much immediately after that, however, he makes the mistake of not going straight to the Ottoman Empire, but going up to Dagestan in the Caucasus Mountains, where he wants to basically subdue a relatively small set of clans in Dagestan. They do not form up in closed order formation for a pitched battle against Nāder. They know that the overwhelming military might of the empire is irresistible. So they withdraw into the mountain passes, and Dagestan in Turkish means Dal is Kuh or mountain, so it's Mountanistan. It's the ideal territory to resist large numbers of professional military troops. And after many years of campaigning, eventually it basically subdues, and Dagestan is brought under somewhat of very tenuous imperial control. But what this causes is enough breathing space for all the doubters and all the people who are not so keen on the new Naderid dynasty to rise up in Iran. There are numerous rebellions, and there also seems to be great instability in the internal makeup of the empire, because the empire now at this point is not composed of a homogeneous group anymore. It's composed of a great multitude of religions, creeds, people with various territorial identities and religious and confessional identities. So these tensions boil up into major rebellions all throughout the 1740s, which is why Naderid's empire never goes any further west. He has a few campaigns, but as soon as he starts making headway against the Ottoman Empire, numerous rebellions break out in his rear and he has to come back. Eventually, he cannot weather the storm of these rebellions and the legitimacy of the empire collapses. In Khorāsān, his royal guard basically step into his tent and assassinate him, and that is the official end of the Naderid Empire, a very ephemeral empire. So, what is the reaction of the people in Iran to the military defeat of the Safavids and the Afghan, Russian, and Ottoman occupations? How do they see it, and how do they see it from the lens of Namus and patriarchal honor? So, the very first couplet that you see here is to do with the idea of Namus and Iran itself losing its Namus. It reads, بداند ناموس ایران بدادند ناموس ایران به باد که رحمت بر آن قوم بی‌باک باد. They gave away the Namus of Iran, they forsook the Namus of Iran. May God have mercy on that fearless group. Of course, it's speaking about the Safavids. The author of the Mukafatnameh, from where this couplet comes from, was a Safavid official who was very disillusioned with how the Safavids were running Iran, and basically blames the Safavid king and his administration for forsaking the Namus of Iran. And the idea of Namus is not too allegorical. There's a very real sense of the occupation being a threat against familial and female members of the ruling clans. In one of the Arabic language treatises on how to basically make good the dominions, or the medicine of dominions, that's what Tabul Mamalik means, we have the following claim. Much blood has been shed, and the sons and daughters of the Shi'i have been taken away in captivity as slave girls and captives. So the idea that the occupation is just not a military and abstract political occupation. It's a threat to women. It's a threat to the chastity of the family of the Shia elite of Iran. And this is also reflected in even the Safavid discourse. Remember Prince Namus? He writes a letter to the northern clans, basically admonishing them for forsaking his dynasty and not adhering to his commands. And what he accuses them of is shedding their military uniforms and taking up void professions worthy of merchants and peasants. He then basically asks them, have they abandoned our royal majesty in order to sit at home, wasting their time conversing with women? He warns them that if they don't take up arms against the enemy, that their womenfolk, their ismat, is in danger of being taken captive. So he admonishes them further for lacking honor, or gayrat. This here is quite clearly also going to the root of why the military occupation happened. There's a great deal of moralizing. It's not because of administrative problems or economic problems or administrative problems that this problem occurred. It's basically a lack of masculinity, a lack of honor, a lack of gayrat that brought on the catastrophe. And this is also very much reflected in the sources as well. One of the paragons of moral virtue and military masculinity in Iran at the time was, of course, the first Shi'i Lord and Imam Ali. There's a very famous account of him in one of his battles coming across an old enemy called Amr As, and how this enemy basically saves his own life. He knows he's going to be defeated by Ali, and he knows he's going to be killed. He basically drops his sword and then drops his pants and exposes himself in order to basically make himself so wretched, so detestable, that he'll elicit mercy from Ali. And it works. Ali basically does not consider it within his dignity to be able to strike down a man who would basically debase himself and let go of his nāmus in such a public way. So he stays his hand and he does not kill him. The author of the Mukafatnameh, the disillusioned Safavid poet and official, he uses this line, in terms of their trickery. He's talking about the Safavid army and how unmasculine they are. In trickery, they are all much like Amr As, who found basically mercy after debasing himself. So the idea is we are very much far from the ideal of masculinity and military virtue as exemplified by Ali. And in fact, we are very much the opposite of this. We embody all the values of Amr As, his enemies. We embody his bi-nāmusi. We have let go of our nāmus. And remember, it is the Mukafatnameh which basically says the nāmus of Iran has been forsook. The second one, یکی خویش را بر مثال زنان بیاراستی تا که شاه جهان توجه از آن را فرمایدش به جا به پایگاه افزایدش. This was written by someone who was basically taking up arms to establish his own dynasty. So he's also very much keen to denigrate the Safavid legacy and basically make room for his own kind of dynastic claims. Here he says to the Safavid elite and the elite of Iran in general, you made yourselves as though you were women, you dressed yourselves as though you were women, so that the king of the world, here he's basically making an ironic reference to the former Safavid king, so that the king of the world will basically look upon you with favor and give you promotion. So it's very much the idea that the reason why the previous order failed was because it was run by people who were unmasculine, who were very much feminine in how they were, who got promoted. It was based on who wore dresses like women. It's all to do with the idea that to make a comeback, to end the occupation, and to defeat the enemies of Iran, one must go back to a masculine self. And Nāder is very astute. He basically sees this trend and a great many other trends, and he adopts them to basically help advance his own political career. Here on the left, we have Nāder in the green robes, and he's at the court of Prince Nāmus, who sits in the middle. We can see that quite literally, Nāder here is the bigger man of the two. So what we have is basically a series of texts and a series of chronicles which very much talk about the overthrow of Nāmus by Nāder as a form of restoring honor, a form of helping preserve Namus. So one of these contemporary chronicles basically talks about how Nāmus went to the Ottomans to do battle and lost in that battle, and how that basically exemplifies the fact that he's a coward and he's effeminate. He is not as masculine as Nāder, and therefore not as worthy of Nāder to basically run the kingdom. And what happens is Nāder calls a council of Iran's elite in the capital and basically asks them for a judgment on who should be made king, who should basically run the country now that Nāmus has been defeated against the Ottomans. He says, this cowardly and honorless prince, Nāmus, who did nothing but waste away his time with slave girls in the harem, while his own sisters and mothers were themselves slave girls in Afghan captivity, is fit for nothing more than drinking and fraternizing with pretty girls in the harem. When he faced the Ottoman army, he led the troops of Iran to an ignominious defeat. He remains on the throne. As long as he remains on the throne, there will be no honorable reputation left for the people of this land. We must now elect another scion of the Safavid household to be king. Quite conveniently, he chooses Nāmus's small son, who was maybe 6 or 7 months old at this time, and he basically positions himself as the ruling regent. He takes all de facto power, and this allows everyone to basically go along with him because he's not taking power for himself, de jure. He's officially basically saying, we need someone else who's still a Safavid, but who is not going to be dishonoring us, who's not going to basically be abandoning and forsaking our nāmus in battle with the Ottomans. And there are various other chronicles which also reflect this narrative. So another chronicle, which is not patronized by Nāder, but is by a military officer in Nāder's army, speaks of Nāmus as having no shame and no nāmus, bi'ari babi nāmusi, and how he basically wastes all of his time away by fraternizing with harem girls and drinking. So the fusion of military masculinity and the ability to preserve the nāmus of the elite and the nāmus of the people of the land is quite apparent here. What we have is basically the continuation of that theme in Nāder's final push for absolute power. And this is when he becomes the Shahanshah, or the emperor of Iran. He also commissioned the Shahnameh Naderi, which is basically an epic in his own name, basically glorifying his masculine and heroic military deeds. And the way his seizure of power there is basically justified is also very much along these same lines. So Nāder calls a council from all across Iran, and that is the Council of Mohan that is portrayed over there. What happens there is basically an election, if you will, by the ruling elite of who should be the new king. And Nāder is basically being very modest and saying, I want to retire, I want to go back to Khorāsān. And it's you, the ruling elite of Iran, who now have to choose who rules the country. And you have to choose someone with these qualities. And then he basically just gives a list of his qualities. In the Shahnameh, he's quoted as saying, "Jahan ra nabashad agar shahriyar be viran shodan, rai nahad ruzgar." If the world does not have a prince to rule it, then it will go to ruination. And the second line is, "Nabashad cho dar khanei kad khuda konad banuyash ba ghulaman zina." If a household does not have a patriarch at the helm, then his servants will sleep with his wife. It's too transparent almost how he's tying military masculinity, patriarchal honor, with the need to select a new king, a new masculine king, who can basically preserve the nāmus of the realm and the royal household. So, what I would say in distinction from this is we have basically all the accounts which survive, which are from the people who finally triumphed and won. At the same time, there were a lot of questions with regard to Nāder's own nāmus and his sexual propriety himself. After all, he's accusing Tahmasp of being this philanderer and womanizer who's just, unconcerned by state affairs. But while he himself was very much, while he himself was very much not the opposite, but quite similar in a lot of his tastes. He was a womanizer, he drank quite a lot, but none of these make it into the official historiography of the empire. We have from various Dutch East India Company reports and representatives accounts of people questioning Nāder's parentage. After all, Nāder himself was from a very modest background. His father died when he was only a child. His mother basically had to raise him and his brother all alone. And there are questions with regards to his mother's conduct at the time. The mother, we know, eventually remarried, and this was considered by many a great shame for his mother to have basically had more than one husband, even though it was many years after his first father's death. So in the Dutch East India Company, we have a very interesting anecdote. In one of the drinking bouts that Nāder hosts in Isfahan, and a lot of Khans are invited, everyone is drinking and getting drunk, and conversation is flowing quite freely. One of the attendants basically starts lamenting about the fact that one of the provinces does not give enough recruits to the center. And Nāder says, what can you expect of men who are the sons of 1,000 doubtful fathers, meaning their parentage is kind of ambiguous, let's say. And then the person who made the first comment, because he's so drunk, he can't stop himself, he'll say, well, one such as you. And this basically causes enough of a rupture for Nāder to have him taken out and executed. These kinds of Turco-Mongol drinking bouts, they were very much freewheeling. It was meant to be a place where the Khan and his retainers basically sat, drank, and basically spoke much more freely and frankly about things. But this is such a break with the idea of Namus and Namus study that Nāder sees no other way to satiate his honor and keep his Namus other than to have him executed. We should just end by saying that this idea of military masculinity and its relationship with Namus and being sexually having correct sexual mores is something that is reflected in neighboring kingdoms as well. So after Nāder basically takes over Mughal Hindustan and makes the Muhammad Shah, the Mughal emperor on the right here, his vassal, a lot of Mughal historians and a lot of Mughal authors also start speaking about how Mughal society is too effeminate and has lost its masculinity, and it needs to go back to its former masculine self. So one of the histories by one of the officers is quite transparent. It says, "How can man who has spent a lifetime fraternizing with women muster the courage to take the battlefield?" So here again, we have what was happening in Iran start happening in Mughal India. And this idea basically develops in some of the Mughal narratives that who exemplifies masculinity is Nāder on the left, and Muhammad Shah is very much an effeminate figure, and that's why society is in such a crisis. And this is even reflected in some art. I'm going to basically, these are censored, so I think it's okay. But this comes from a miniature from Nepal, the north of the Mughal Empire. And it's from the early 19th century. And on the left, we have Muhammad Shah. And the way you see it is basically the bodies are parallel to one another, whereas on the right, Nāder is clearly in the more dominant position. And most important of all, what is he holding in his right hand? A sword. So it's just directly related, unambiguously related to military masculinity. And I think we'll end here. I hope I haven't used too much of the time, so we have enough time to basically accumulate.
Thank you very much, Amir. Right. Have you got any questions?
I've been looking recently at European pictorial representations of the 18th century. Nadir Shah as a heroic conqueror, etc. And there was this discrete tower skulls appearing above his head, which clearly connects to what you're discussing, the military masculinity concept. So does this come from a historiographic literary narrative, or is it also an element of the Naderid iconography of this period, this tower skulls?
I think what you see in the official historiography is military masculinity portrayed as Nāder at the head of his troops, basically vanquishing various foes. But there aren't too many images of the Tower of Skulls. Basically, that came about, I think you're referring to Jonas Hanaway's book, yeah, where Nāder is basically taken as a tyrant and someone who is basically going around executing vast numbers of people who are failing to pay tax, who are failing to pay tribute, and failing to pay respect to his imperial kind of setup. So I think these are kind of distinct. The official historiography, masculinity is portrayed in relatively uncontroversial terms for what then would have been uncontroversial. But the Tower of Skulls, that's definitely something that Nāder and his secretaries were keen to kind of expunge from the record.
Thank you, very interesting, and the visuals are wonderful, really wonderful. I want to push you a little bit further in the question or in the relationship between this kind of kingship and masculinity. And do you reckon, and I'll say later why I think that it might be worth pushing that direction. A connection between conceptualizing power, household, so empire, household, and gender relations in a way that kind of balances between different elements. And I'm saying that because, and it's worth reading studies by Rosalind Johannan, who looks exactly at this conceptualizing of the balances of the humors, the functions of the body, of the organs of the body, with the good balance of the state. So turning, conceptualizing, at least in the Mughal context, the body politic to the household, and then exactly this kind of balance between masculinity or masculine elements, feminine element, the control of the masculine over the feminine. So do you think that we see signs of something a bit more, even more systematic about the whole worldview of the good order of the state in things from this period?
I think that that's definitely a line of inquiry worth pursuing. I haven't taken it in that direction yet, but basically the feminine element in Naderid historiography is almost non-existent. It's basically what you hear about is the women are being protected, the women are, preserved, the nāmus and honor is preserved, but you will never hear about them. And I think this was actually a part of the ruling elite's kind of mantra and ideas of what made them legitimate as opposed to the Safavids. I think one of Nāder's brothers-in-law basically speaks with an Ottoman dignitary, and that Ottoman dignitary records their conversation. The brother-in-law of Nāder basically falsely claims that when we took power, we killed all women in the family. That's how much we respect nāmus. We don't even think of providing the possibility of our women folk falling into the wrong hands. We basically remove that possibility altogether. We know, of course, he was just bragging and they didn't do anything of the sort. There's not a record of even a single execution. But just the fact that he would say that, just the fact that he would make that claim kind of speaks to just how important and how zealous they are in this period about regarding nāmus as the most important and the most precious kind of value that the imperial household has, even to the extent that we would kill our own in order to kind of stave off any possibility of dishonor.
And also positioning, to continue what you're saying, also positioning them as better than the Safavids. So the Safavids failed where we succeeded.
Yeah.
Whereas the Safavids themselves also tried to hide the women.
Yeah. I mean, the practical differences are not that much. It's just Nāder does an excellent job and his secretaries do an excellent job of providing an image kind of contrast. Look at us and look at them. Yeah. Even with regard to the womanizing, I think I already mentioned, Nāder was very, very keen on women. He was basically keen on having as many women as he could get his hands on, even more probably than Prince Tahmasp. It's just that he curated this image of him as, I don't care about women, I just care about fighting for Islam, Iran, and Shiism. That's what concerns me. Whereas practically, I mean, I don't think there was that great of a difference. All the kings enjoyed drinking, hunting, women, and so forth.
Actually, if we're at it, can you just explain a little bit more about his own parentage? That because he came from a little bit of a dubious, questionable background, right? Yeah,
I mean, there are questions we know about his mother's conduct after his father passed away, his biological father passed away. So this might have actually kind of made him more zealous and more conscious of this nāmus dynamic. You could say, was overcompensating for the fact that, there were people who were openly questioning it. I mean, that drinking bout in which the lieutenant basically makes a slip-up that costs him his life, it shows that these stories got around, and they're in the kind of European accounts, and they're in some of the Persian language chronicles as well. So they were well known, I think. So it might have like encouraged him to become very zealous in kind of like perpetuating this narrative of I'm very respectful of Namus. It's the most important thing to me in my household.
So is this particularly to Nāder, this idea of politicizing, if you like, this idea of patriarchal honour, because it's, you know, at the lower levels, as you said, it's very widespread, you know, in how women behave, etc. But here he's turning it into something else, into a sort of political approach to how to control people and how to manage his rule.
It's definitely something that is already there. Like the former Safavid official who basically laments, like, the Namus of Iran has been forsaken by the Safavids. It's like, so there's clear concern of, and the other one, the Tebul Mamalik, medicine for, that was also written before Nader's rise, in which I think it's a Sufi kind of cleric. He's talking about our women are being taken captive. They're being kind of like made into slave girls. So there's this great kind of anxiety around sexual honor and namus already in society. Nāder sees this opportunity and says, I'm going to make political use of this. I'm going to construct narratives and construct a public image which basically draws on this anxiety. And this is something that we can see in even like contemporary politics. Politicians don't just come up with new kind of narratives just by themselves out of the blue. It's very much, they look at society, they pick out what is my base anxious about, and they construct a narrative to speak to those anxieties. And he does this remarkably well. With regard to this, Namus, and many other kinds of anxieties running in society then.
Right, we have one question on the chat. There we go. So thank you for the interesting talk. Could you say something about Nader Shah's women and wives being saved and protected after his assassination by the Afghan force led by Ahmad Khan Abdali, who later became Ahmad Shah Durrani and founder of the Durrani Afghan Network?
Well, first I would have to say that the people who assassinate him are not his Afghan followers. In fact, it's his Iranian followers and people from his own clan. It's very much the Afghans and the Uzbeks especially who are seeking to protect him, because as the empire is basically expanding, more and more Afghans and Uzbeks are being enfranchised into this kind of military class, and the old guard, who are basically Shia from Iran, are very suspicious of the newcomers. And this is one of the tensions that basically leads to his royal guard, who are from his own clan, to assassinate him. With regard to what happens to his women, I think they are untouched and then taken to the natural fortress of Kalat. But there aren't too many sources about what happens to Nader's women. We know that pretty much all of his male progeny were either executed or ended up killing each other. But with regard to the women, I'm not sure exactly. The record isn't clear.
Do we have any other questions? No, we have nothing more in the chat. Well, it's just for me to say thank you very much. Oh, no, we've got a comment anyway. Have you had the opportunity to explore the campaigns of Nizam Ali, the Shi'i ruler of Hyderabad?
Only very briefly. I have a few sources on it, and I basically saved them in a file somewhere, and I'm hoping to maybe turn them into an article sometime.
There's a comment underneath that Nizam had 2 battalions of female troops. So,
I had no idea.
Impressive.
Yeah. But that's something I can say definitely does not happen in Iran at this time. There's no hint of a single woman taking on arms or anything like that.
It sounds horribly declining. It's really not companion.
Right, yes. Okay. Right, well, that was, yes. Well, I think we will finish there for this evening. So thank you very much, Amir. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining us on the Zoom. And we'll go and we'll have a drink and your audience can interrogate you further or ask more questions. So thank you very much, everyone.